Welcome, everybody, and this is another episode of Quaker Libertarian Conversations. We are once again joined by Jared Warner and Juliet Nail. I'm Matt Hisrich. Good to see you all again, and we're ready to dive into an important conversation about state or private provision of goods and services. Before we do that, though, let's take a moment to center down. All right, I'm going to stop sharing here. And Jared, you brought up an interesting thing in our last video. Do you want to tell us what you had started to say then?
Well, in our last video, we talked about a lot of things. And towards the end, I brought up a topic or a question that gets asked quite a bit. If government doesn't pay for a lot of things, what happens with roads and streets and in our cities and towns, and how does that work? So one of the main questions that I'm asked as somebody that claims to be a libertarian is, well, what about the roads? Who's going to build the roads? And I find it kind of interesting because I think we're people that are very innovative, so I think we could figure it out. So, but maybe we need to figure that out together, because cooperation is very important. So who builds the roads in a libertarian worldview?
That's a great question, and I think it's become sort of memeified on Twitter and whatnot. This has become sort of the classic rebuttal to any kind of libertarian perspective or free market perspective is who builds the roads, because the government does that, right? And as we'll get into later, this applies to a number of other areas as well. But thoughts on road building, and Juliet, you had found an interesting quote that you wanted to share or get us thinking about.
Yes, so I'm going to paraphrase, but this was over at the Urban Agorist, and his perspective or question is government roads, like all projects, distort the market. So in the case of roads specifically, our interstate, well, let's just say our interstate system, in the case of roads specifically, he mentions the subsidies during the Eisenhower administration. So subsidies both directly to the roads themselves, but also to the automotive and the oil industries. And so his question that he brings up is, what amazing technologies would we have today if we hadn't subsidized and put all our eggs in the basket of this type of road and vehicle and fuel, right? So I thought he brought up a really good point. We lock up our resources when we do that. And I think one of you guys had talked about, what is the reason that we get governments to build our roads? And it's not for humans and commerce.
It's a good pitch to make. We're helping everybody get around easier, but more often than not, it's related to getting military goods around. So that was certainly the case for Eisenhower with the interstate system. Easy transport of troops and materials from one side of the coast to the other for the purposes of national defense. And I would say we're going to talk about the Bible a little bit here today, and that would be the case for Rome too. They were trying to get their armies around the nation. Sure, commerce was part of that, and allowing people free access to transportation, but sort of the underlying rationale was military. And Murray Rothbard and others have talked about the kind of distortions, to Juliet, that you raised in terms of even how we think about city, rural, urban context, the ways that government roads have distorted property values, have changed the way we allocate resources in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. But I think the sort of what underlies this "what about the roads" question is, how do we even conceive of something different when the government does so much in this area? And would we just sort of flounder about without the government sort of directing all these resources the way it does now? I don't know if either of you have given any thought to that, but it is a big challenge for libertarians.
Well, the one thing that I always think about, I grew up in rural Kansas, and the interesting thing is you will find pathways all over the place where various animals have walked in certain areas enough that they make a path to a source of water or a source of food, and they continually walk the same area. So there is a distinguishable pathway made by animals. You can walk in the middle, absolute middle of nowhere, and you can find a trail that deer make. So the concept of not being able to find a path is one that even in nature, they make roads. Animals make roads that they will use constantly because it's the easiest terrain to walk to get to wherever they need to go. So humans do that as well. I mean, if you read in the New Testament of where the disciples are walking, one thought that comes to my mind is when the disciples were pulling heads of grain off and eating them on the Sabbath. They were walking on a path. It was technically a road. By any other definition, the road went right through the middle of a field because that was the easiest way to walk from one place to another. And they just grabbed the heads of grain that were next to the roadway or the pathway. So, it's people make paths, and they make them in the easiest way to walk from one point A to point B, whether it's up a mountain, if it's by a river or something like that. They will make a path to the easiest crossing of a river. They'll make a path to the easiest slope to walk up a hill. And that's just human nature. That's animal nature. We don't like to work harder than we have to. So the concept that we wouldn't have roads at all is, by studying nature itself, we do make roads, and everybody makes roads, from the most wild of deer to the most civilized human being. We are all making some sort of pathway to make our lives easier. So we will make roads no matter what. It's just, how are we going to go about
it? Yeah, and I think one of the assumptions is that only the state, federal government, depending on the context, city government has the resources to be able to devote to this, and or the sort of legal basis on which to do it. Yeah, but Jared, you were pointing out in our last video that actually there's a history of private sector doing this and doing it right now. And of course, historically, if you look at turnpikes and various things, I live in Indiana, and everything around here is pretty much named a pike. And the reason was, I suspect at one point these were private roads. And that's still going on today. Jared, I think your example was out in front of the store you work at.
Yeah. When areas are developed, the people that are investing money in those areas want their property to be successful. So they will build access to those areas. In front of my store, there is a sign that says this is a private road. It says that means that the city isn't the one that clears the snow off of it. The city doesn't maintain it. The city doesn't do anything except put a sign up saying this is the name of the road so that you can find it on a map. and whenever there's a pothole in that road, whoever owns the property is the one that fills the pothole. And sometimes it's divided among a couple of businesses, so it doesn't get filled very quickly because they have to work it out. But usually it gets filled very quickly. And you see that in residential areas when developers are building houses in an area. They want to make sure that their property will sell, so they build a road to give you access to that particular area of land. One of the nicest roads in our community is a private road because they want people to move into that area. And so private companies will invest in roadways so that their business will succeed if there isn't any other options. So, and we had an article that Juliet shared from the what group is it? Fee. I don't remember what what it stands for right off the top of my head. Something about economic education, I think, is what it talks about. But it talked about how Washington was annoyed with the roadways in New England because they weren't straight. They're all crooked. And they were built to go from field to field and house to house because the people that owned that land wanted a easy way to get to where they needed to go. So, we build roads. On my family's farm, we have roads all over the place that nobody except my dad takes care of. And we even have bridges going over, the creeks and the rivers that we have to cross to get to another field. We have bridges that we maintain that we take care of. So, it's not a very hard concept to think that private individuals would take care of their own property so that they can have the best use of it and have access for potential customers or clients.
Well, Jared, you bring up a good point. I was talking about this with my husband ahead of time. And so first of all, I'll just bring up the point that it's not just building the roads, it's maintaining the roads. And, we live in Minnesota, and we have a lot of snow. In fact, it's pretty unusual for Thanksgiving weekend. We had snow cover about 3 weeks ago, but we don't have any snow cover right now, and that's very unusual. And we were talking about we have a lot of bike trails because we are in an urban area, and the snow removal. So we have people that bike commute year round in this community. We have one of the biggest bike commuting year round, even though it's so cold and snowy. But the snow removal, both on the roads and the roads, it's a little more consistent, but on the bike trails, it's super inconsistent from town to town because the bike trails, no matter who owns it, it's plowed by the cities, right? So it's really hard to figure out if you don't know that, because you think, oh, the county owns this, it's hard to figure out who to bug to get to plow it. And anyway, so kind of I was talking to him about that, and I was like, well, one thing we could do in a transitory system is, so you're talking about people, so whether it's businesses, individuals, a homeowners association, whoever owns it is going to maintain it, right? And you can charge money. There's different ways. Maybe you get a sticker. I think one of the links you guys had us talk about, was it Rothbard talked about, you can issue and charge stickers for people to go through. But another way to do it is say, how about those of us that use it pay for it? So like, we only have one car, we specifically don't drive as much. I'd much rather pay for the bike trails than the roads, right? So, if we had a system, a libertarian system, instead of paying taxes for everything, we could pay taxes for the stuff we wanted to. So that's kind of my 2 cents.
Which kind of goes to what Matt brought up about the turnpikes. if I'm remembering my history well enough, wasn't it Daniel Boone that made the first turnpike through the Cumberland Pass or something like that? And, you know, he, or was it Davy Crockett? I don't remember who. One of those people that died in the Alamo. But if you want one area of your state or something to be populated, and if you have a really difficult area to cross, such as the Appalachian Mountains, then if you were to find the area that you could pass easily, it wouldn't be very unlikely that other people would be interested in that and invest money to ensure that that area gets traveled. And if you make it an investment type situation and a toll or a turnpike sort of situation, then you can benefit, as well as public at large could benefit from the building of a certain roadway in a certain area, because it is the most efficient way of travel. So it's not uncommon for something like that to happen. And if we really think about it, most of the railways began as private industry as well, and they use the government in a lot of ways to try to force people to sell them the land, but overall they were private industry. And we have railways all over the United States. A lot of them around here are being turned into bike paths, but they began as private investment. And
I want to go back to a couple things, threads that you're all throwing out there, and the bikes being one of those. I mean, we've got bike paths that were installed in our downtown area, and there was a lot of controversy around it, because exactly the point that you're raising. There were parts of the community that really wanted bike paths, and the city put them in, and there were parts of the community that didn't want their taxes to go to that. And so it would be interesting to kind of shift the narrative about roads to think of them not as public goods, which is the general perception, but really symbols of force and power, because that is fundamentally what they are. And the eminent domain piece comes in here. The controversy over who pays for what comes in here, because at its root, if it's a government entity taxing in order to put this in, all you need is 51% of the population to agree that's where the road goes, if that, right? Because you're not voting on every road. So government has the ability to have force behind it, and we see that, as Jared brought up with the trains. In some cases, they pull that out. They say, well, we want to put our road right through where your house is. We're going to go ahead and take your land, and we can do that because we're the state, as opposed to voluntary cooperation to determine an equitable arrangement so that we can come to some agreement about how to put a means of getting through. And I think that's something that, again, many friends, many progressives, many conservatives who think about the value of roads don't think about that sort of fundamental force piece that goes into our road system right now. And what are the implications of that if we want to have a peaceful, voluntary society?
Well, one thing from a Quaker perspective, so we've talked about this before, when Quakers decide something, each individual Quaker has a veto, kind of how our filibuster used to work in the Senate before the nuclear option was implemented. So, and the important point of that filibuster or that veto is that every individual, in the case of Quakers, or in the case of the Senate, each senator has the ability to veto it and have their concerns addressed. So I think what you're bringing up with eminent domain seizure is, well, there's a couple things. The individual's concerns are not getting addressed. So, so I guess from a Quaker perspective, I'm really interested in that piece of what do you do when everybody else has said okay, and you have one farm blocking And, the Quaker answer, I think, and you guys tell me, is you can't do it if they don't consent, right? And then, that's really the piece that I'm looking at is you have to consent. So I don't know. Is that the Quaker perspective? That's kind of how I see it.
I think it comes back to if you're not consenting, then something hasn't been addressed. So we need to rethink how we're either approaching the project or maybe we haven't explained it well enough. And so there might be a concern that that isn't the best place to put a roadway because of environmental factors or something like that. So maybe the reason that we're not getting the consent is because, the soil in that area is not stable enough to support the road. So it would actually cost a whole lot more. Or maybe it's just, why destroy natural beauty if you don't have to? So, there's a lot of factors there that probably do need to be addressed before we force people into submitting to certain aspects of our culture or society. And that's something that I think Quakers can speak to some degree, because we do have to work through, people that aren't in unity with the rest of the meeting. And if you don't work through those problems, then you have people that are upset within your community. And with something as permanent as a road, you would want as many people to be in favor of it as possible, because it's not going to go away very quickly. I mean, there's still Roman roads that are being used in Europe today, and Rome hasn't been the empire in Europe for how many years? A couple thousand almost. So, and the roads are still there, and some of the bridges are still being used. So they are permanent structures. So we need to make sure we're doing it wisely. So,
this is I've seen an example of this where at the time I saw it, it's been years ago, I just sort of thought it was laughable, but there was a retail development and shopping spaces and parking spaces in front of it, and smack in the middle of the parking space up against the road was a house. Because you have to assume what happened is the developer wanted this land for parking, and the homeowner was not willing to agree to the terms of the sale. And so they still have their house. It's just surrounded by a parking lot and a strip mall behind it. And yes, it's kind of hilarious, but we know the alternative. If this were a roadway going through, the government would just say, well, this is what you're getting for the value of your home. Maybe this is where you were or raised your kids, or whatever the family history is there, and that's what you're getting. And good luck taking us to court, because you can't really do that. So again, what are the ways that we can think about providing services, and roads is a big one, right, that everybody brings up, but of course this applies potentially to healthcare and schools and really anything that we have to make any kind of communal decision around provision of services. And we can't, like, what we do when we're not all in unity, how do we handle that?
Well, and one thing that was, I was just thinking about as you were talking is, and I haven't heard this in any libertarian circles or anywhere else, but couldn't you, much like the colonies were started where it was a company and people bought into that, or stock, really, a publicly traded company, couldn't it be handled as an equity and people buy into the road and invest, like shareholders, normal people, put my $2 in per share, and maybe I just put $50 in, and maybe Jared's loaded and puts in $1 million.
I'm not loaded, but
yeah. You could get out. So, you do it as a share, and then we're all liable. So my big issue is always liability. So whoever builds it has to be liable, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's, I'm suggesting an equity stock type of thing. It's, I mean, there's humans are so creative and flourishing. I mean, we can build it anyway. The one thing is, like if you don't have money and there's no incentive or community incentive, you know, some people aren't going to be serviced by roads, and we have that today. So you can't force that. So that's kind of a, but I guess would they be serviced today in a governmental model? You know,
this is, we see various examples of where provision of goods takes place through commercials, for example, and radio, TV has changed significantly in the last decade or so, but it used to be the case too. All you needed was access to a TV and you could watch anything, or a radio and you could see it. You weren't paying for those services. So who was providing them? It wasn't necessarily the government providing NBC or whatever the case may be. It was private companies who were providing that broadcast based on the fact that they could sell commercials for what they were providing. So you could extend that, I think, to a road model, and we do that to some extent anyway. We see billboards and whatnot on the side of the road. As long as people have a sense they can have access to an audience, they might be willing to help chip in for it. I don't know if that gets to what you're thinking about.
Yeah, interesting. Or naming rights. Like Larry Sharp talks about naming rights to big bridges or big roads. That's a good point.
Yeah, a big bridge is a very permanent way to allow people to know your business is successful in your area. So I would think that would be a great advertisement for the community. But it's providing services to areas. I think the public or broadcasting is one of a very good example of how private companies can provide a service to everyone around without necessarily using government to provide access to that. And there are regulations on bandwidth and stuff like that, but our local radio stations buy the equipment to broadcast. The TV stations buy the equipment to broadcast. They don't necessarily get that from the government. And then there are those few cases where they do get some subsidies from the government for things like the emergency when a storm's coming and there's an emergency in the community, they can preempt a show so that they can put out that news. But that as well is we bought the time to use that, so that's a service to the public. But even news companies will preempt a TV show. And I remember as a kid, I hated every time that we had to miss our show because we only had 3 channels. So it wasn't like we had entertainment everywhere. We had the 3 channels and we could only watch the one show at a time. So I hated when the news came on to say, tornado's coming. I'm like, I know the tornado's coming. I can see it. I live in Kansas. So, we can provide those sorts of information as a courtesy, or we can sell that time as well. So I don't necessarily think that we have to rely on government to provide it all for us.
I think Wi-Fi comes to mind as another sort of contemporary example where there's, depending on where you live, sometimes the community will come together and say, we want to cover downtown with Wi-Fi service provided by the government. Or in many cases, businesses just start to see this as a part of their expenses that they need to cover if they want to attract customers. And yeah, if you're going into Starbucks or wherever you happen to be and they don't have Wi-Fi, you may go down the street to the next next place that does, because you want that customer. So
our yearly meetings, our Quaker yearly meetings, can finance a road to a community that's underserved.
It's possible. I mean, that would be a good and wise investment in my understanding of things. But you know, I've often thought of, you know, yeah, I think we could make roadways across Kansas or across, you know, Indiana or something like that. If there was some financial benefit for a family to invest in a roadway, I think a lot of people would invest. I know when my great grandpa was alive, he invested in several hospitals because the communities needed hospitals. So he put money into these bond things to help build hospitals, and he was very successful in doing that. So, and contrary to what a lot of people believe, Kansas has a very good health network because a lot of the people in the community stepped up and said, yeah, we need hospitals in these rural communities, and we're going to put our money into that. And it paid off. So I think if we allow people to come up with ideas and then brainstorm how would we make this happen or get it to happen, we can come up with a lot of solutions.
So the fact that you bring up healthcare, I'll try to be brief, but that was something that I was thinking about today. Before, I mean, you guys, I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember, but even when I was a little girl, you had more nonprofit hospitals, like paid for by the Catholic Church or Lutheran Church or whatever. I don't know if we had any Quaker ones, where all the patients, the church paid for it and it was free, or very cheap. And, you know, and prior to World War II and fixed maximum wages, everyone talks about the minimum wage. In World War II, you had maximum wages. So our current healthcare system is because of maximum wages. You had a lack of labor. So in order to attract labor to your tire company or whatever, you offered them healthcare. So then the market became distorted, and all the co-ops that, you know, your fraternal organizations or neighborhood plans that had mutual co-ops for healthcare, or, you know, whatever, the religious ones, a lot of those, except the very biggest, went out of business. Only the very biggest stayed in business. So the government's involvement in healthcare, I mean, it wasn't directly an involvement, but a government distortion, much like our Urban Agorist is talking about with the road system, it distorted healthcare by then mandating it. At some point, it then became mandated that businesses over 50 employees had to provide healthcare. So that completely got rid of the voluntary mutual system. So yeah, so we've done a lot of these things in our past, and we've just forgotten that we know how to do it.
There's a great book, if you haven't seen it, David Beito's From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State. It kind of covers this transition very well. And you know, for those who would say, well, I'm not religious, and so am I going to have to go to the Catholic hospital or whatever? There were, like you say, there were fraternal organizations. There was sort of this massive network of places that provided healthcare for their members, and that was a big part of why you would want to voluntarily associate with others and build that sort of. It's been called the like intermediary sector between the individual and the state. That was flourishing, and it was partly these labor regulations. It was also Social Security that came in and really dismantled a lot of this voluntary association, retirement, healthcare, all the kind of things that people had previously done, and it's been in a place for so long now, for so many decades. It is almost impossible to imagine what actually existed really not that long ago in the United States.
I don't know if I have anything else to add. Surprising that I had nothing else to add. But I remember I grew up going to the Shrine Circus, and the Shriners were mainly there to provide for cancer research and that sort of thing for kids. So, I enjoyed going to the circus when I was a kid, and I feel good that it helped people get the medical care that they needed. I'm not a Shriner, and I have no intent to become one, but I sure enjoyed their circus, and I enjoyed watching them in the parades doing their little carts. So I had plenty. I invested as much as I could into the Shriners and their work. So, but I think we can do a whole lot more than we realize if we just allow ourselves to.
Well, I think you had mentioned who will build somewhere. One of you had mentioned, the answer to who will build the roads is we will, or at least the people who are building them now. It's really who is going to pay for it, right? And that's really what we are addressing today.
Yeah, and I think if we need a road, our communities will work together to get a road where it needs to be. So I have a lot of faith. So
yeah. And what kind of community do you want to live in, where you can come to agreement about what the needs are, or where a politician is making that decision, and in some ways probably lining their pockets with whatever land sales are going on associated with that road or railway or canal or whatever the case may be, which has certainly been the case in the past. Well, I don't know, have we answered today's big question?
I think so. We didn't talk about homeowners associations, but that's a perfect example of it happening today, right now. And what's interesting about that is any of us that have dealt with a homeowners association, a lot of times people complain about like people being power hungry and whatever in these homeowners association. Well, you can complain about that, but imagine that in the petty little stuff you see right there, that's going on 1,000-fold in Congress, and they have the force of violence and government to use against us. So, and here we have an olive, a voluntary olive. So,
Our fourth member of the conversation.
There we go.
I'm going to go get my makeup.
Sorry. Yeah.
All right.
We have families.
Yes. Well, and that's good. So let's tune in next time. We don't know what we'll cover yet, but it will no doubt answer more questions that you may have. If you have more, always send them in, and we'll try to run them here together.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
We'll see you later.
See you, everybody.